Your meeting for Thursday, March 18, 2021. The time is 7:45. Please call the roll.
Trustee Evans,
Aye, here.
Trustee Gallegos,
Here.
Trustee Hannan,
Here.
Trustee Giza,
Here.
Trustee Pollock,
Here.
President Sells,
Here.
Village Manager Francis,
Here.
Village Attorney Molina. Mars, Village Attorney Mars.
Here.
Also present Village Clerk Haley.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now. We'll pass the Pledge of Allegiance because we didn't work very well last time. If you're joining us, we are starting this meeting late because of a special meeting that we had prior to this one with the Preservation Commission, Landscape Advisory Commission, and Parks and Recreation Board to discuss the Swan Pond Path and also the sidewalk addition in front of the swim club. So we'll move now to presentations and public comment. First up is an update on criminal justice reform legislation by Chief Weitzel. Chief Weitzel.
Good evening, President Sells, Manager Francis, and trustees. So in your packet is a review of the criminal justice reform bill that was recently passed. For those of you that might know, the actual official name of that act is the Safety Act, and that stands for the Safety, Accountability, Fairness, and Equity Today Act. That's what the legal name of that legislation is. And by far, it's the single biggest piece of criminal justice reform or criminal justice legislation passed in my 37 years in law enforcement. So the intent of my memorandum to the manager and the board is, from a financial perspective, to let you know where we stand going forward with the act. So I think some of the board members know I serve on the legislative committee, so I've been meeting on this legislation since its inception, and I still meet either in person or by Zoom. We have, the Illinois Chiefs have meetings every 2 weeks. So as far as the impact that the village will see, what I have outlined in my memorandum is very conservative because we really don't know. Well, there's a couple of things I can tell you for sure. There's absolutely no funding with any piece of the components that are in the over 700-page document. Now, the only known funding is the governor's office saying that there's going to be some funding in the form of grants for the body camera program. Whether that's going to be fully funded, partially funded, matching grants, or first come, first serve, we don't know yet. The guidelines have not been put out. They're supposed to be put out by the Illinois Training and Standards Board in the future, but even they're confused on what that's going to look like. And just to take for a moment for a perspective of something I did include in my memo, this past week, the Illinois police academies in Illinois, and there's several of them, have all proposed suspending every academy in the state of Illinois for the next 6 months until they can retool on what to teach at Basic Recruit Academy because of the legislation. So they're going to change their curriculum based on the legislation. And in order for them to do that, they believe they're going to have to take a hard break for 6 months, which is severe because COVID has already put us back over a year. It's very difficult to get officers into basic recruit training right now. And if they delay that by 6 months for reorganizing the educational component of basic recruit training, it's going to have a severe impact on hiring new officers. And that was just released this past week. Now, that hasn't been decided, but it's being discussed. So from the financial component, you can see in the legislation, there's 11 pieces of the different training components actually take place July 1st. And those are review of the qualified immunity, and there was great debate on that. So you may have heard that they withdrew qualified immunity from the final bill, which is true and not true. So they did withdraw the qualified immunity provision that they wanted to include, but they have a task force set up by the governor's office that has to report back to the state legislators after 60 days after the provision, which is supposed to go into effect July 1st. That task force will review on whether they should revisit the Qualified Immunity Act for law enforcement. And what I mean by the cost isn't known, if what is proposed, that police officers lose qualified immunity, how that would affect villages is in lawsuits, in litigation, and potential litigation. So it would be enormous. And I was not in favor of that because it doesn't mean that we can't still be held accountable. So officers that still act outside the scope of their authority or severely outside the scope of policy and procedures are always still held accountable. The qualified immunity isn't just big brush that just, gives officers complete immunity from being held civilly responsible for their actions. So that there's still a task force that needs to report back to the governor. That could have a severe impact. I think our village attorney could tell you that if we were to lose that qualified immunity as it currently exists. The other training components in there, they range from $5,000 to $8,000. And that's being based on what it costs us to train our officers, the whole department, and then cover street coverages while we're sending officers for training. The governor's office said some of it will be internet-based training, but we still have to have officers sit in the station in front of a computer for sometimes 8 hours a day, sometimes 40 hours a week, depending on the training. And we still have to cover the street for calls for service. So we're paying overtime to cover the street coverage to pay for officers to attend training. Now that's nothing new. We have to do that on a normal basis, but to think that the internet training is automatically less expensive is not factual. And another big component is they want to increase the police academy 2 more weeks. So that would, it already is taking, if this bill, if I was to send somebody to the academy July 1st, currently, we would not have that officer working for us until 2022 as it stands now. 4 months of the police academy, 3 months of field training, all the requirements that need to go in to get officers trained, and then on their own, you'll be looking at least 9 months. So there is a proposal to increase the academy 2 weeks because of the different components of the legislation. Some of the financial points that are in the law, I've never been a believer that law enforcement agencies should be revenue generating sources, but the fact of the matter is a lot of what we do is associated with fines. So the provision about driving privileges, that's not known yet because they want to, the legislation will reduce some criminal components, which will mean that we'll have less tows, which means that cars that were eligible to be towed because of arrests, we won't have those fees associated with that. And the citation cost of arrest, they're going to defer a lot to the judges on waiving fees and fines. Now, judges can already waive some fees that they seem to be excessive, but they really aren't supposed to be waiving fines. So this legislation will give them more ability to do that, which could mean more loss of revenue from specifically citations. And then one of the biggest components is the body cameras. Now, I've been a supporter of body cameras long before it was popular, but it is expensive. On the low end, it's 80,000, probably to 150, maybe even 200,000, depending on the type of equipment we choose, the manufacturer we choose, how we set up payments, what we need to run the program. So we definitely need, at a minimum, the body camera, docking station, batteries, extra cameras for malfunctioning, because the new law says that a police agency can't say that we bought 20 cameras for 20 officers and then 2 of our cameras went down, and we can't use the excuse that the officers didn't have the camera on the street because they were malfunctioning. We have to be able to provide backup cameras for when they malfunction. It's written into the statute. And storage, maybe a new server, and certainly redaction software. So we are obligated by law to provide redaction services so that people's information and photographs and videos are not included for public dissemination when they're not supposed to be. The redaction software is very expensive. Some companies build that into your overall cost. So, and I have suggested to the manager and my fellow area chiefs that if we go down this road, that we really should try to all buy the same type of product, especially since we have a combined dispatch. But some agencies are already ahead of it. So I think it'd be a good avenue going down that we would use the same products as our neighbor, because we can share video. Lawyers and defense attorneys that want to subpoena our video, we have the same systems, the same redaction, and the same hardware, and we back each other up all the time. So Riverside, North Riverside, Brookfield, our officers are interacting constantly. So for me, it makes sense to buy the same products. I have been a proponent of the legislation. I am on the Chief's Legislative Committee. There is some talk going on about a trailer bill, but that trailer bill is only for cleanup language. It's not meant to change the sense of the criminal justice reform bill or to what was passed or what the governor signed. It's just to clean up some language, hopefully, that is conflicting in different parts of the statute. So there is a review from the Illinois Municipal League, which is excellent. I think that Illinois Municipal League usually do not distribute their information to police agencies. It usually goes to the managers and mayors, but this time we were included on their dissemination of information on this bill because it directly affects municipalities, not just the police department itself. So I just wanted the board to know where we stand going forward, and how you might have to budget for it in years going forward. I will say that some of the chiefs I've talked to, the camera companies don't make you put it all up front. I want to make that clear. So for example, if we got a contract with WatchGuard, which is what company, or Axon, which is the parent company for Taser, which a lot of municipalities are going with, we could, if the product was $150,000 for Riverside, we could negotiate a deal to pay $25,000 up front, and then we could make payments on our investment over a 5-year period. We don't have to come up with the lump sum money all at once. So I think it's important to remember when the chief is negotiating in the future and the manager is negotiating in the future, that I have talked to chiefs that have negotiated into their contracts that they don't have to pay it up front. So you don't have to be hit with that huge cost all at once. But that's my brief. I just wanted the board to know where we stand, just financially, and to know that these are projections. Could be less, I doubt that. Could be more, I see that happening. At least, I don't see much funding coming out of this. I do believe that the villages are gonna have to bear the expense of it, at least the body camera program. So I would take any questions that anyone have. If not, I just want to make sure you were aware of the current legislation.
Thank you, Chief Weitzel. Any questions for Chief Weitzel? Before we move on, I forgot it twice in a row now. Mr. Mars, do you need to do the COVID statement before we continue?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Once again, due to the ongoing public health emergency and consistent with the governor's most recent emergency declaration, various executive orders entered by the governor, and recent amendments made to the Open Meetings Act, this meeting is being conducted electronically. Just a reminder, if anyone has any trouble hearing each other during the meeting, please contact the host or raise your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Morris. So any public comment? Would anyone like to address the board this evening? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the president's report. What I want to do this evening is just to begin a kind of a general public dialogue about the next steps with regard to the Groveland flood wall. As you may know, back in December, the board decided to move on into the design and engineering phase of this project. And as part of that, we asked Burke Engineering and Doug Gotham, their landscape architect, to do a couple renderings for us of some potential designs so that we could see kind of what is possible out there. So I want to share a few of those with you now, but I want to first, strongly make this point that these are computer generated images that we're looking at. So they're not going to have the detail of a painting or a drawing that's been done by hand, but it will at least allow us to have something that we can use as a start point. So the first thing that I would like to show is what the Army Corps originally had presented to us back last year. And as you can see, it's a fairly uniform single color wall. It does have some patterning to it, but nothing really in terms of any kind of architectural detailing. We can go to the next one now. So what we have here, what Mr. Gotham did, the landscape architect, is he looked for other walls that had been designed by either Olmsted or Olmsted and Knox to try to pick up some of the design details that they favored in the walls that they've used. And here you see one from Franklin Park in Boston, and you can see the various design elements. They're indicated in the yellow captioning. So if we scroll down now, you can see, so this is the general idea of picking up those design elements. But now if you zoom in, let's go a little bit farther in. Once you zoom in, and you'll start to pick up the color variations and also the different texturing of the walls. I did speak with Mr. Gailey earlier today with Burke. They have just recently gotten some new software that they can use to redo these renderings that will give us even more detail and a more realistic look for these different designs. So we hope to have those tomorrow, but at the very latest, we will have those available on our website come Monday. So now we can back off and let's go take a quick look at the next one. This is from Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And again, you see the design elements. And let's take a look at the rendering now. So this one, unfortunately, doesn't really improve by zooming in. It actually gets a little bit blurrier. So that's why we asked for some improved imaging on this. But here you can see it's just a different look with more of a limestone. And now let's take a look at the next one. So now this one is interesting. This is the rockery in East and Mass. And you can see the design elements here. They start with large boulders at the bottom and then progressively get smaller as you go up, and then you have the vertical sets at the top. Burke did provide us a rendering with this style. This is not it, but the original rendering that had all the stone would be in the 7-figure range. Mr. Gailey said he thought it would be well in excess of $1 million. So that is something that theoretically is possible. However, we would have to find some way to pay $1 million because that would not be covered by the Army Corps. All the other things that I'm showing you tonight, the Army Corps has said that they would be able to cover the cost element of those. But if you scroll down now, what they did provide is this is kind of a hybrid, if you will, and this kind of, it has a little bit of the rockery look, but it's really more of a rip-rap kind of thing that you will experience, down river around the Hoffman Dam and all. And this detail of the rip-rap, the boulders, which would kind of soften the bottom edge of the wall, could be used either on the Franklin Park or on the Prospect Park iterations, so whichever one. So like I say, this is just to get us started. Thank you, Karen. You can go back now. Come Monday, we'll have the improved images on our website. So the other thing that we've discovered since our last time we talked about this in December is there's been a continuous discussion about the need for what's called a Section 106 review by the State Historic Preservation Office, affectionately known as SHPO. And we have discovered since then that there was, in fact, an analysis done by SHPO back in 2015. And in 2015, SHPO determined that the Groveland Wall, with specific reference to the Groveland project here in Riverside, would not affect any historic resources within the village. However, that letter of approval was only good for 2 years, which in a way is a good thing because we now have an opportunity to provide additional input to SHPO from the village. So what's going to happen here is in the next month, we're going to ask the Preservation Commission and the Landscape Advisory Commission to take a look at these these drawings. Actually, they'll be getting the new drawings under the new software to give their feedback with regard to their preference on design. We will also be discussing these designs at our next meeting on April 1st, and then again on April 24th. So we'll see how quickly this process can move along. If there is a consensus among viewpoints, it's conceivable we might be able to, the trustees might be able to make a decision on a design choice come the second meeting in April. The advantage of that, reaching that point with the design choice, is it would give us something specific to provide to the State Historic Preservation Office with exactly what it is we have in mind, so that they could see an actual rendering with regard to delivering their Section 106 opinion. So again, this is really not for discussion this evening. I just wanted to let folks know that these images are out there. We're going to be discussing it more fully in the coming month. And we welcome the input of the public, either at our meetings, or you're also, of course, welcome to go to the Preservation and Landscape Advisory Commission meetings to provide input there as well. So that is all I have for my report. Manager Francis.
I do not have a report this evening.
Okay, we'll move on then to the consent agenda. On the agenda this evening is to approve the voucher list of bills of March 18, 2021, approve the Village Board of Trustee regular meeting minutes for March 4, 2021, review and file the following: the Economic Development Commission meeting minutes for January 14 and February 4, 2021, the Riverside TV Commission meeting minutes February 8, 2021, and the Community Development, Finance, Fire, Police, and Public Work Departments February reports. Also, a resolution to approve an amendment to the Village of Riverside Flexible Benefit Plan pursuant to the CARES Act. And finally, a resolution authorizing the village manager to waive competitive bidding and execute a sales agreement with Curry Motors Commercial Center Ford for a total not to exceed $30,570 for the purchase of one 2021 police utility vehicle. Does anyone need anything removed for discussion? Hearing none, I'd ask for a motion and a second to approve.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Gallegos, second by
Mr. Pollock, Trustee
Mr.
Pollock,
Pollock.
second.
Thank you. Please call the roll.
Trustee Evans,
Aye.
trustee Gallegos,
Aye.
trustee Hannan,
Aye.
trustee Giza,
Aye.
trustee Pollock,
Aye.
Motion carries. Moving on to reports of departments, commissions, and trustee liaisons. Are there any liaison reports this evening? Hearing none, we'll move on then to considerations. We have no ordinances or resolutions. And first up is a discussion and direction on a final design element for the Swan Pond path. And so, Mr. Tab, you get to do this again.
Yes. All right.
Earlier.
So some of you were on the previous special meeting, but for those of you that were not, I kind of want to recap where we've gone with regards to the Swan Pond path. So back on June 18th, 2020, the board elected to move forward using exposed aggregate as the material for Swan Pond path. On February 18th, 2021, the board chose to include shoreline stabilization as part of the path project through the use of limestone ledge rock. On March 4th, 2021, the board decided the inclusion of a river access point, also known, as a river access point, was desired as part of the project. During this meeting, staff was asked to evaluate options as well for a dyed concrete center line to run the length of the path. So after the meeting, staff met with village engineer who confirmed with multiple concrete contractors. Staff has noted the following options regarding a dyed concrete center line. The first option will be considered a full depth dyeing of the exposed aggregate. And with that, the full depth dyeing of a center line along the walking path would require 3 separate concrete pours. The separate pours would require pinning the 3 concrete components together in order to maintain the structural integrity of the path. Even though pinned together, the structural integrity may still be compromised due to the freeze-thaw cycles experienced in an often saturated area. Option 2 would involve the surface dyeing of the exposed aggregate. Dyeing the surface of the concrete, while an option, leaves some concern to its long-term durability. The surface would eventually need to be re-dyed at unknown intervals. Surface dyeing of exposed aggregate will vary in appearance due to the exposed aggregate itself and the concentration of the stones at the surface. So taking this into consideration, the previously noted items, staff recommends foregoing the dyeing of a centerline on the walking path, the incorporation of exposed aggregate into the design of the path, similar to the rest of the village's sidewalks, is to provide a naturalistic soft appearance, mimicking the natural environment which Swan Pond is known for. The incorporation of a colored center line down the middle of the path may contrast with the surrounding environment and draws one attention to the path as opposed to the natural beauty of the park itself. So with that being said, I'd open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you, Director Tab. So before I turn it over to you, trustees, I know you heard the discussion at the special meeting, but for those who are just joining us now, I'm going to make an attempt to run through the suggestions that were made by the Preservation, Landscape, and Parks and Rec Board. If I miss one, I would ask that you please correct me and add it into the discussion so that you can all be on the same page. With regard to preservation, their primary concern was to make sure that the ridge rock, the limestone ridge rock, was a more naturalistic design, that it wasn't too uniform and too steppy. I believe that Mr. Gailey got that message loud and clear and basically told us that it is not going to be as uniform as the design drawings suggest, but the preservation was concerned about having a more naturalistic look. The outflow pipe that is currently there with the one-way valve, they suggested relocating that and trying to get it closer to the shoreline, and also putting in an inline valve, which would be integral to the pipe, and so you wouldn't see it the way you currently see the one that sticks up now. They wanted to make sure that the drawings themselves were modified to show that we want to save all WPA walls. And then there was some concern that at certain locations we might want to consider 8 feet if finances become an issue. And Mr. Gailey or Mr. Tab can speak to this during our conversation. They are recommending a 10-foot path. If you were to reduce it to 8 feet, of course, you would have 20% less material cost. So that's preservation. LAC was concerned about having the correct look for the exposed aggregate. Mr. Gailey basically said that whoever gets the contract, how it's going to look is going to depend on what quarry they go to in terms of the pea gravel. So LAC suggested the possibility of having a poured sample first before we pour the whole thing so we can see exactly what we're getting. They were very concerned, as we all are, about protecting the trees and the grasses in the area. They also suggested the possibility of tapering the path to 8 feet, especially as it approaches Millbridge, because of the more narrow nature of the park at that point. Should signage be needed in the future with regard to the river access, they were concerned that we use some kind of uniform signage so that all of the signs in that general area look pretty much the same. And then lastly, with regard to Parks and Rec, their main concern was ADA compliance, and Mr. Gailey is going to look into what the situation is down there with regard to ADA compliance. And then Board Member Dvorak asked about the 2 other ridge rock areas, not the river access that is actually designed to have a river access point, but she was concerned about these other ridge rock areas would naturally be used as access points. And so is there a safety issue there? And if that's going to happen anyway, should we consider having some kind of break in foliage with regard to the plantings so that people can access those ridge rock areas. So did I get everything as far as everybody can see? Okay, so then in that case, I will turn it over to trustees. It's all yours. We're just trying to reach a consensus on how we want things to look so we can get the bid documents out. Who's first? Mr. Gallegos?
Sure, I would be in favor of a width of 10 feet, if that's what's better for our emergency vehicles. I believe form follows function, so I prefer 10 feet over 8 feet.
Actually, why don't we take that one first? Is there a consensus for 10 feet?
Yeah, I like 10 feet. Anybody who's walked the path knows that we need, with others, knows that we need 10 feet. But if there is a space in the path, I guess there was a certain point in the path where we might be able to narrow it to make room for or accommodate the other things that are around. I mean, it's fine. I would say it's okay to narrow in a portion if needed, but for the most part, I think 10 feet would be the best for the commuters or the walkers and the cyclists and the runners.
Mr. Hannon?
Yeah, just to clarify a question for Director Tab. You had mentioned a number of times, at least I understand it, that 10 feet is preferred for vehicle access and emergency vehicle access maintenance, and that 8 feet would be inadequate. Is that, did I hear that correctly?
No, I'm not saying 8 feet would be inadequate. I'm saying 10 feet would be preferred as vehicles, I'm thinking, for instance, a fire support vehicle, if we, for some reason, have to do a rescue out of the river or something, we're bringing down equipment, the boat, the pickup truck, and we're stepping out of these things and we're kind of working adjacent to them. Sure footing would be preferred in the middle of the night, as opposed to either stepping in mud or slipping in mud or driving off the path in the mud and getting stuck and so forth.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks for the clarification.
Sure.
With that, I would favor the recommendation of 10 feet.
Okay, so it looks like we have a consensus on the 10-foot issue. I assume we also have a consensus on the desire for as natural a look down there as possible. That seems kind of like a obvious thing for everyone concerned. And I know that Mr. Daly appreciates that as well. What about the pipe relocation and the inline valve? That would be an expense. I believe Mr. Daly said you're probably looking at $5,000 to $7,000, but at least you wouldn't be seeing that thing sticking up out of the water. What do you think of that?
I have a thought. So, yeah, in proportion to where we are planning to put the canoe access point or the river access spot, whatever you decide to call it, it's really not a great spot for that pipe. Not to mention it just doesn't look very nice. So if there's a way to move it so that it's not so intrusive, and it's kind of jarring when you're walking down the path too, to see this huge black just lump coming out of the river. So I think if we can afford to move it, it would be better.
Just for clarification purposes on that, the access point would be located at the northernmost erosion point, and that discharge pipe is located in the center erosion area. So where you'd be, in theory, entering the river, that would not be where the pipe is. It's in the center area.
Right, unless we elected to provide access to all of them.
So where would we move it?
Well, it would be moved closer to the shoreline or the water line, because right now it extends, let's say 8 feet out into the water. So at low water level, you do see the pipe, you do see the valve. The intent would be to bring it closer to the water line or the shoreline, so you're not seeing 8 feet worth of pipe. The valve would be tucked as close to shoreline as possible, with still maintaining the functionality of it. You know, the alternative is, like Orion mentioned, was doing an internal valve, except, you know, you're looking at $5,000 to $7,000 just to make the valve disappear in essence. And I'm not sure on the maintenance required for an internal valve such as that. I'm sure debris would might play a role in that. Maybe you could speak to that, Orion. Probably got more experience than myself.
Yeah, it'd be similar to the duct bill that you're dealing with now.
Okay.
Okay, am I correct that we have a consensus on that as well then, that we're willing to spend the money for Mr. Pollock?
I'm willing to, I guess I would suggest that we include it in the engineering or the contractor bids and see how the prices come in overall and reserve the right to revisit that if our bids come in high. But as far as moving forward at this point, yeah, I would be in favor of including that.
Mr. Hannon?
Yeah, I tend to take a different view. I mean, in a perfect world, I would love to move that pipe, but I think we're, you know, the original discussion was on replacing the asphalt path with a better path. And, you know, that's a pipe situation exists now. You know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is something that we can also address at a later date after the path is completed if funds arise. You know, I really don't want to get into, you know, mission creep, you know, now that we're already over budget, that adding on to things that, you know, we've lived with for so long. You know, if it's something we can do at a later date, you know, I agree with Trustee Pollock, let's put it in there and see what it costs. But, you know, if it's going to significantly move the dial on cost, I just don't think it's on the list of the must-haves for this project.
You know, if I can interrupt, one thing we might be able to do, not that I'm looking to undercut any engineering, but we could probably at a later date do the install of a valve as such in-house. You know, whether it's you know, just moving it closer, putting an internal valve in there, or doing some kind of gate or flapper valve on the outside of it. We can address it down the road if we don't want to incur the cost of having a contractor do the work.
I suggest that we leave that to Director Tab and Mr. Gailey then, let them figure that out. If it's something we can do in-house, obviously that's preferred. If it isn't, I think we have a consensus to at least include it in the bid documents at this point, right?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, we're going to preserve the WPA walls. Take a look at what LAC talked about. We're obviously going to protect the trees and the grasses. We've already dealt with the 8-foot issue. We obviously would use uniform signage if signage was needed. What about the porch sample? I actually had a question about this one for you, Orion. I was thinking about this as I near the end of my second term as president. I think I have a future in concrete. I think I've learned more about concrete in the last 8 years than I ever thought possible. But I understand what you were saying about, you know, it all depends on what quarry they go to. But I thought I remembered something from a prior conversation where we actually did have preferred quarries that we like to use specifically because of the high quality pea gravel we got. Am I remembering that wrong?
I'm guessing what you're thinking of is when we were still incorporating the Swanee stone into the CBD area, and that only comes from one quarry. Otherwise, I don't recall ever specifying the quarry. I suppose we could, but you may not get to that.
Because I do, Chairperson Maloney, I think, has a legitimate concern. I mean, it's one thing if we're replacing a square here or there, but we're getting ready to lay, 2,000 feet of this. So I think it behooves us to know what we're getting. Mr. Pollock, you had a comment?
Well, I was you may be, President Sells, you may be recalling the discussion when we, I don't know, 6 years ago when we talked about going to a brushed concrete sidewalk, and we decided to stick with the aggregate. And I had suggested that we look into finding a preferred quarry for that reason, so that we have that consistency. Now, in the discussion in the special meeting, Manager Francis mentioned that we have developed a fairly detailed specification for the sidewalk, and it appears that we've had a lot of success with that. So obviously we would follow that spec. I mean, I think it's pretty typical to do a sample pour on something like this, and I can't imagine it adds really much cost, maybe a tiny bit, but so given that, I think it's a fine idea as long as it's not extremely costly to do a sample pour. But I think you know, I assume we'll have an engineer on site, a project engineer monitoring the project, and they'll watch for these things, and they'll know to make sure they're following our spec. If there is a preferred quarry or whatever, then great. But I think staff knows how to make sure this gets done right.
Other comments on that point? Everybody in agreement? Yes. Okay, Ms. Francis.
Clerk Haley has a public comment that we received with regard to Swan Pond. So before there is the final consensus,
Well, who was it that has a comment?
the village clerk, we received an email of a public.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We did receive one comment on this topic. It is from resident Dale Yates of Groveland Avenue. And his comment is, please move this proposed project to future consideration. The village needs, as stated by the Public Works Department previously, more improvements to street, sewer, and water lines as a priority before Swan Pond. In review of the last board minutes referring to this as a generational or legacy project, my concern is that other community priorities are being set aside in favor of someone's vanity project. Aside from this, the project already has cost overruns and in the planning stages and vacillation as to materials to use, i.e. consider limestone pad for kayak launch, paving bricks down the path, etc. Noted potential use of concrete or aggregates also seem to be counterintuitive to this floodplain. This is excessive, and during these difficult times, particularly in view of the village's current shortfalls and budget concerns, there is no room for vanity projects at this time. I suggest that in lieu of the Swan Pond costs, spend the money on an experienced grant writer for projects such as this in the future.
So let's move on now to take a look. I think that was everything with LAC.
President Sells, I'm sorry, may I?
No, of course.
I just wanted to clarify something, Manager Francis. We are receiving grant funding for this project, correct? We're not paying for this out of money that we could use for street repairs for the most part, correct?
Correct. The street money is very specific with motor fuel tax and the non-home rule sales tax based on the referendum that was approved many years ago. We are going to be paying for some of it out of pocket depending on how the bids come in. Ultimately, that'll be dictated by the scope that we're coming up with essentially right now. And that could be anywhere from the 125 to the 130 that we initially discussed at our last board meeting. So that would be absorbed by surpluses and reserves that we have available for these types of projects that the board elects to do. But yes,
I just wanted to be clear about that because the resident has a very good point. I mean, if we weren't getting grant funding for this, I don't think any of us would be talking about it. If we were just using reserves or whatever, but the fact that we do have an opportunity to invest a little bit of our own money for much, much bigger project is an opportunity that we can't afford to pass. Thank you.
point, Mr. Pollock, I mean, basically, 4/5 of this project is, roughly speaking, is being covered by grant money that that our staff was able to procure. And just to reiterate something that I mentioned at the last meeting with regard to having qualified grant writers, in the last 8 years, we've been awarded over $14 million in grants. So the folks we have doing this in-house are quite competent at it. So now going on and taking a look at the Parks and Rec concerns, obviously we can't really address the ADA issue tonight. Mr. Gailey is going to look into that. But the question about the other two Ridge Rock locations, and Mr. Buckley, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this. One of the concerns that one of the board members had was, is this going to be a potential safety issue? Because presumably people are going to want to get down onto those rocks. What is your thought about that?
You know, as you spoke to, as a fisherman down in those areas, that water level is normally at a very low level where you could walk out there. And we actually have fishermen that wade out into the water, and usually it's around at their knee level. It's when you get a little bit further out there that it actually starts getting deeper, where that you said, and you talked about where that channel is that actually goes through there. So as far as that being an issue right there in that area during flood time, you're not gonna be able to access that area. The water's gonna be up to probably the top step of some of those areas where they're looking to put the actual steps going down. So they're already along different areas behind the library there. There's basically a 2-step type of wall where you could actually walk along it. And we have not had any real issues regarding that in that area either. So I don't consider it to be a safety hazard as far as we're concerned.
Director Tabb, I'll bring you in on the other point that they raised is if people are going to use those locations for river access, does it make sense to have a break in the plantings there so they don't just get trampled anyway?
Well, that would be determined by how often it's used, honestly, and what type of plants that would be planted there. If the sedges or grasses that grow to 3 feet tall, or whatever it might be, it may dissuade people from going down into that area. I don't know, honestly. I really couldn't forecast the use of any of those areas.
So I'll turn that question to the trustees then. Do you want to stick with the current idea of having plantings there and then just kind of see what happens?
Yeah.
Ms. Evans?
I do. I'm sort of hesitant to start thinking about making 3 access points, just because you can see a lot of the erosion is where people do hang out by the river. And because those were areas where we were going to put a stabilizing wall to keep the path up, I was just sort of wondering if it would be better to keep people away from those areas. Okay. I guess it's a matter of how much do we want to close off access to the river over there, or do we want a little bit more control to alleviate long-term damage to the area? It seems counterproductive to let people start climbing all over it when the point of the wall is to stabilize the path.
I see a lot of shaking heads, so I assume that there's agreement on that point. So we'll just stick with the planting plan as indicated. So those are the only issues I had from the commissions. Are there? I assume that given the staff's research and recommendation, we're no longer interested in the dying concept. Right. No. So do you have anything else? And Director Tabb, do you need further guidance from us or Mr. Gailey, further guidance about any kind of design issues? Mr. Gailey?
Yes, please. 2 topics. One would be the width of the entry point for the river. We currently have it designed at 10 feet. I know a couple of the committees had some concerns about that width. Are we good with 10 feet? Do we want it narrower? Any direction there?
Consensus by the board to stick with 10 feet.
Okay.
I mean, obviously there are certain points there that where you can't go to 10 feet and that'll obviously have to come in.
I
But
meant for the river access point, not for the whole path itself.
oh, I wasn't,
So where the path ties into the river access point, we're bringing.
okay, I
concrete-
misunderstood the commissions then. I thought they were only talking about the width of the path. Trustees, what do you think about this with regard to the, so are you only referring to the river access point, the singular, or?
Yes, so at the river access point, we have concrete that will extend to the ledge rock. Currently, that's designed to be 10 feet wide. I know Sander and Commissioner Pipel both had maybe some concerns about the width of that being
Well,
too wide.
Point, because I mean that the usage that leans toward the 10-foot width on the path in general doesn't really apply to that, because this is really just a way down to the river access. Trustees, what do you think about that?
I actually have a question on that, Orion. So you're saying that the pathway, the limestone or whatever it is not going to be consistent. You're going to have the concrete butt up to the steps. Couldn't you just have the limestone go to the path itself so it's not as harsh?
You could do that too. So you just have a limestone path going to the exposed
Or more
aggregate sidewalk.
natural?
That could be an option too, certainly.
Other thoughts?
I guess I'm okay whether it's limestone or exposed aggregate, but I think the 10 feet is okay.
I echo Trustee Pollock.
Same here.
Is there any interest in Mr. Geese's idea about having it limestone, or do you want to keep it aggregate to tie in with aggregate?
I guess I would say it depends on cost. I'd go with whatever's cheaper.
Is that okay with everybody?
I'm indifferent. I don't have a preference.
Exposed aggregate is probably slightly cheaper, but I don't think there's a large difference in cost either way.
I thought it's more of an aesthetic issue. You know, I mean, do you want to have, you know, a limestone path coming off of the aggregate? So that you're going to have to Trustee Geese's point, you're either going to have a break in materials at the path, or you're going to have a break in materials at the ridge rock. So which do you prefer?
I'd agree. It's probably a more natural look to have the limestone in between the ledge rock and the path, but it's probably a little more functional to have the exposed aggregate, but I don't think it's a huge difference either way.
So with that said, do we want to do the limestone, Mr. Pollock?
Limestone.
Yes.
Yeah, if there's no material cost difference, I'd go with the suggestion of Orion.
Okay. What was the other thing, Mr. Gailey? You said you had a couple things.
So up towards that hill where we get up to Burling, there was questions about whether we're making that ADA compliant. I don't have the topography in front of me to say one way or the other, but I'm fairly certain that the running slope is greater than what ADA would consider compliant. So we would have, if we want to make that section ADA compliant, our two options would probably be to either do a switchback to get up the hill so that we're maintaining a running slope of 5% or less. Alternatively, we would need to put a handrail on both sides of the path for the area that is greater than 5%, which would probably be a majority of that hill. So I guess the question would be, do we want to move forward with making that ADA compliant? And then if so, which of those two options is preferred?
So the switchback sounds expensive and aesthetically problematic as well. Trustees?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
If we put the rails on both sides, should we make it wider for the convenience of our emergency vehicles that might have to go down there?
I think 10 feet still wide enough. Dan, you can jump in there, but the edge of the railing would leave you with 10 feet to get through.
I would say that's sufficient.
The thoughts, Mr. Pollock?
Would you have to do you think you'd have to do railing on both sides?
Yep.
Yeah, I definitely do not want to see the switchback. It's going to take up too much land and expense and not be
Yes, I
attractive.
agree.
If a simple railing can make it just on the slope part can make it compliant, then I guess I wouldn't object to that.
Okay. Material wise, wood?
Metal? What kind of metal would be okay with the elements that we see out there?
I don't know if there's any railing there anymore. There used to be some real old railing that was leaning at about a 45-degree angle towards the river. I'm not sure if any of that's still there, but that was just a tube rail, I believe. I think a more natural look is probably just going, and obviously most cost effective would be a wooden fence, but we can look at other options too.
Mr. Hannon?
Yeah, I think the wood blends more with, sort of the overall nature of that park area. I think anything metal would be somewhat visually jarring, where, the right kind of wood design would blend with, sort of the vista going from the street. Also, if you're down there enjoying, the nature that's down there, it's not something that would necessarily catch your eye, given the fact that it would blend in with the other colors.
I was thinking more about an upkeep type of thing where wood may not last as long as metal would. I mean, the paint's gonna flake or whatever we decide to design on there would be replaced probably more often than maybe wrought iron.
Yeah, you could put the wood in a couple times before you get to the cost of the wrought iron, for what that's worth. But
Yeah,
yeah,
for that, how often would we replace longevity of wood versus wrought iron or stainless steel, whatever metal is best for the outdoors, and that we can decide from that point.
Sure.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of, as we're having this discussion, I'm envisioning some of the parks and all that we've been to, and that the wood railing really does lend itself to the more foresty kind of look, and it makes it feel more like a natural area, I think.
Yeah, we do multi-use paths through conservation districts and things of that nature, and it's 99% of the time we're doing wood.
Okay, so are we, is there a consensus at least on that? Wood railing?
I like wood.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Tab or Mr. Gailey, that you need from us?
No, thank you.
Book on this one. Thank you very much for hanging in there with us for so long tonight, Ryan. We appreciate it. Dan
I just had one more thing to say.
Yes, please.
When we look at the aggregate color, we want the color match to be the same as the existing color on the sidewalk at the top of the hill too, right? Is that what we're comparing? And then also was the ADA compliance, is that an issue on the other side of the path at the top near Joliet Road?
Down by Berry Point or Millbridge, whatever. I can't remember what that is. It's already ADA compliant. So we're tying into the existing crosswalk that was just put in 2 years ago or so, and that was ADA compliant already.
I would just make a note regarding the color. Any existing sidewalk that you see throughout town has been there for a few years now and has become dirtied. So it does have a darker appearance than concrete or exposed aggregate. If you were to take a power washer to it, it would brighten up like any other concrete that's been outside for a while. So to compare it, when all this new concrete's going to be laid, it's definitely going to look different than the existing concrete just because it's not dirty yet. So
Yeah.
For point of
And to add to
comparison,
that, if we do a test strip, the exposed aggregate right after a pour and after it's been exposed is going to look different than after you seal it, and you don't seal it for roughly 30 days after you pour it. So,
Well, I mean, I guess
could be
I would kind of
timing
wonder
issues
what's
there.
the point of doing the color check? Can we maybe power wash the sidewalk so we can make sure we can get as close to a match as possible ahead of the match?
well, ultimately, like Orion mentioned, depending on who the low bidder is on the contract, we don't necessarily have a say to what quarry they go to. So ultimately, our say is somewhat limited regardless of what the power wash sidewalk looks like.
right, unless we pour a test strip and the board says they don't like it and it's purely based on the color, then there would potentially be a change order associated with making them get the concrete from a different supplier. So, I mean, we'll certainly have staff out there. I can go out there during the first pour just to make sure it looks like the rest of the 100,000 square feet of sidewalk I've put in the village. And,
Okay, thank you.
I can certainly do that.
Okay,
If I may, President Sells.
please.
Just for an item to note, if I recall my Richard Ray discussions about concrete, the concrete that is over on Burling, I believe is not necessarily exposed aggregate. It's something mixed with granite, I want to say, where it's a little bit more sparkly and it has some other color variation in it. So just an item to note that it's, we've got a couple of different variations before we settled on the exposed aggregate. So I just wanted to make the board aware.
Thank you.
There is older sidewalk along the Swamp Pond Hill there for sure.
Okay, I think we've put this one to bed. Ms. Johns?
I have a comment from Ms. Marsh Osga. The question is to please ask legal whether southern access egress at bridge meets ADA.
We did, I thought.
Yeah, I think Orion just addressed that a moment ago.
We did.
And let's make sure we understand what she's asking. The grade at Millbridge meets ADA. And if that's what she means, then it's answered. Another way of interpreting her question is having one ingress egress location. Does that satisfy ADA, or do you have to do both ends of the path have to be ADA compliant?
Is that sufficient to negate need for access egress at Library Hill?
Yeah, so I think that's what she's asking. If we have one way, one entry point that is ADA compliant, is that sufficient?
Right, I
Purely
think
from an
Orion
engineering
said that.
standpoint. Oh, sorry, Mike.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think Orion said he was gonna look into that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, purely from an engineering standpoint, I would recommend that we make both ends ADA compliant, just to limit the exposure to the village if there was some sort of incident on that hillside.
Okay. So that's Mr. Hannon. Did you have something?
I did. I'm having technical issues hitting the wrong buttons. I guess my preference would be, and again, this would be a question, I guess, for Attorney Mars to look into. If it's not required under the ADA to have the rails coming down, my preference would be to not add anything to visually interrupt that hill and sort of the exposure. But if it's required under the ADA, it's required under the ADA. It's something we should absolutely do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, as long as we meet the requirements, if there's a way to not have further structure down there, I think that would be preferable. What does everybody else think? If it's ADA compliant without the railing, are we okay to not have the railing? Yes, I see.
It's not
Yes.
ADA compliant without the railing.
Yeah,
Unless-
that's one thing.
Right.
I think
Unless we do switchbacks.
I think the question are we mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act to make it compliant?
Right, or is there some sort of exception that we could
Right.
utilize?
Well, why don't we look into that and we can report that issue.
I'll look into it further. Sure.
Okay, so that's it with the walkway in Swan Pond. So now let's move to the sidewalk at the swim club. Director Tab.
All right. Again, a little bit of background for those that did not join us at the earlier special meeting. On September 3rd, 2020, the Village Board of Trustees requested the swim club to install an exposed aggregate sidewalk in the public right-of-way between Berry Point Road and the driveway apron of the swim club as part of their project. The sidewalk would be at the expense of the swim club, with the village taking over the maintenance responsibilities once installed. This past Monday, village staff met with swim club representatives on site to discuss the proposed sidewalk and identified the trees which would need to be removed as a result of the sidewalk installation. Staff advised the swim club on the expectations for replacement of the removed trees. I believe in the agenda packet, the site plan for this sidewalk is there for you to take a look at. If anyone has any questions regarding this, Village Forester Collins is on the call along with swim club representative Joel Marhool.
And so with regard to the earlier meeting, the main concerns that the commissions had were they want to confirm with the swim club that the trees will be replaced. The main concern, however, was the jog out by the AT&T and utility poles there, so that you have a straight sidewalk and all of a sudden you have this bump out and it goes straight again. So is there some way that the sidewalk could have a more meandering course so that wasn't as quite as apparent? And then the other thing that they were concerned about is where the sidewalk meets the street or meets the driveway apron. Do we have to use the little curbs that you see around the village at the end of the sidewalks, or is there some way to do grading where those curbs would not be needed? So with that, I'll turn it over to the trustees. Ms. Evans?
I agreed with the commissioners. I thought those are really great points. We like our sidewalks in Riverside to be kind of flowy and meandering. And so I agreed with that. And, maybe if we sort of pull the sidewalks away from the edge, it seemed like it was really tight up against maybe the fence of the pool. We might actually be able to save a couple trees too. And then the other issue was that sharp angle where the new sidewalk would join the existing sidewalk along Blooming Bank on the right side, on the east end. Mm-hmm. Will we be able to soften that? I'd like to soften that too, so the turn is more gradual and flowing and meandering. So I'm told the right angles are not consistent with the Riverside hardscape.
Director Tab, or?
Yeah, the right angle that you're referring to is as such because it abuts an ADA ramp. So there is a curb on that, would be the northwestern portion of the ramp that a flowing type accent could not necessarily tie into. We'd have to shift this whole thing northeast in order to accommodate that.
Yeah, and the ramps, that's what the commission had asked to avoid over where the sidewalk would meet the pool, right?
I don't think it was the ramp they were concerned about. It's the little curbs on either side that, yeah, I've heard different, and maybe this is a question for either Mr. Gailey or Director Tab. So what is the point of those? I mean, does it have something to do with the ADA usage, or is it a stabilizing feature that is just put in there as for cost savings?
Go to Ryan.
So probably going back about 10 years ago, IDOT mandated those on their projects as part of sidewalk programs. So most municipalities followed suit. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in another meeting with the Preservation Commission, they announced their disdain for those. So we looked into it some more, and it is not necessarily required for ADA via PROAG. So we've eliminated it in areas where we don't have to retain some sort of earth on, generally speaking, private property. So I guess to that extent, when that was put in, that was funded through IDOT. So that was probably mandated to, because when you have IDOT funds, they will require those side curbs still. But generally speaking, they're not required for ADA. It's more so just to hold back the earth when you're dealing with private property.
So in this section, we don't have to have them. Well, is there going to be a substantial cost in terms of like any kind of regrading that needs to be done for soil stabilizing?
I'm not all that familiar with the site. Joel?
Yeah, the site's fairly flat, so I can't imagine it would have to be regraded as much as some other sites throughout town. This one's pretty flat. I can't think of any area that would require extensive grading.
So, so let's try not to do that, I think, then is the idea, right? I think I see consensus for that. I had a question with regard to the AT&T pole and the ComEd utility pole. Can they be moved?
Joel, you can confer with this, but I believe the AT&T little pole there is AT&T's working on moving it or disconnecting the equipment on it and moving it possibly onto the ComEd pole if it's still required. But the cost associated with moving a ComEd pole would be very expensive.
Correct.
So I don't think that's an option.
Dan, that's correct. And the trustees, the AT&T pole is very possibly not in use anymore. The gentleman at AT&T I'm in correspondence with, and he's investigating it. With regards to the ComEd poles, that gets very costly because that's active power. And we really haven't contemplated that, nor has ComEd given us an option. Our engineer did speak with, or the architect did speak with the engineer, and it is acceptable to have the sidewalk relatively close to the poles. ComEd finds that acceptable. And finally, we can direct the architect to make it a little bit more sinuous as the sidewalk meanders around those poles rather than such severe radii. Last item, if I may, the question from Trustee Evans. The sidewalk at the east end of the project was located to avoid impacting too many of the existing trees that are already out there. Speaking with Mike, those are, and I don't mean to put words in Mike's mouth, but those trees were in relatively good shape. That's why the location of the sidewalk was chosen at that east end.
Is that why the angle is so sharp on the east end?
Yes, it is.
My 2 cents on the path or the sidewalk is, as it looks right now, it looks like it's a mistake. you know, the way it's straight and then it bumps out. If there's some way that it can be made, you know, more river-like, more meandering, more, as you said, sinuous or something like that. I think that would go a long ways to making it look a lot nicer.
One thing we do want to notice is the sidewalk reference the property line between the village and the swim club. So right now it's butted up against that property line. If we can't really meander north, because then we go onto private property. And if we get too close to the, I know we mentioned the proximity to the curb line and snow, and there wasn't a whole lot of concern with regards to cleaning that sidewalk during the winter if it does contain plow snow. You know, I just want to make a point that if we don't clean it right away, it usually doesn't get clean because it ices up and it becomes very difficult to clean. You know, the other consideration of having the sidewalk too close to the curb is if somebody, obviously there's gonna be a lot of kid traffic in this area. Not that there's heavy traffic, but if somebody were to fall off of a bike, I would fear them falling into the road if it were too close to the curb line. So.
But if I can just follow up on that, I mean, right now there's a 4-foot minimum there at that bump out.
Right.
If you just did something as simple as taper it on both sides. So
right, exactly. Sure.
Just you had a much softer curve to it, you would never be closer than 4 feet.
And President Sells, that's exactly what I'm suggesting, that we simply ease those curves a little bit more and work within that corridor that's kind of already been defined on the drawings.
Okay, so I think, is there agreement on that, trustees? Mr. Pollitt?
Well, I agree that simply, softening that curve around that ComEd pole is a good idea and would work. But other than that, I would not move the location of the sidewalk. I think it's too short of a distance to have any other undulation in it. People are going to be making unnatural turns because it's such a short stretch. And if that's what I'm hearing, that's what I think I'm hearing, that you want it to meander more than just around that pole. I would not agree with that. I think it's better the way it is, just soften that one spot.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page here. Just make it more graceful, basically.
Understood.
Okay.
And then Mr. Marhol, not to put you on the spot, but this is what I was asked to confirm this evening. And I'm not quite clear on this. So, and Mr. Collins, you can chime in if you need to. So we're removing some trees. Those trees are going to be transplanted elsewhere. Is that right?
I'll summarize for Mike. What we've received from the village is that due to this sidewalk construction, 9 trees will be impacted and 9 trees will be replaced, not necessarily in that stretch of right of way in Blooming Bank, but possibly on the other side of the street in places that the village forester deems appropriate.
Okay.
And from a approved nursery and plant species to Mike's satisfaction.
That's correct. I'm entertaining Scotswood Common, and then also in addition, maybe providing more screening for the parking lot over on Blooming Bank.
And then Mr. Mahol, the other thing I was asked to confirm is the swim club is aware that they're paying for the sidewalk, right?
The swim club is very aware that we are paying for the sidewalk, and we are grateful to be that Director Tab has allowed us to be part of the village process and contribute our appropriate amount to the global bid. There's definite advantages in economies of scale rather than us paying for it as a small project.
I think I speak for all of us that we're glad it worked out. And you know, I walk by there almost every day, and it's really exciting to see the walls going up. So it's going to be a nice summer. Mr. Pollack?
I'm sorry to belabor this more than perhaps it needs to be, but the swim club's putting in this sidewalk, this public sidewalk, and it's very much appreciated. You know, the idea, if I'm hearing that we're going to have them replace trees off-site, if they want to, that's great, but I don't think we should require that. I think all we should require is that they put in the standard parkway trees in the parkway, which is one every 40 feet or so, as their replacement for what they're removing. I don't, you know, again, if they want to volunteer to replace in kind elsewhere, that's fine, but I personally don't think that we should mandate that.
I mean, all I can say to that is that it was my understanding that that was the agreement that's already been reached.
And that's fine then. If that's an agreement that's reached, that's fine. But just for the record, I'm saying, yeah, I appreciate that very much.
Mr. Marvel, am I correct that has been talked out and agreed to already?
That was the direction we arrived at in September. We would certainly appreciate it if we didn't have to necessarily pay for all the trees, but we follow your direction.
I mean, that is my memory when we were up and trying to hear each other in the auditorium, that was where we ended up. So unless other trustees feel that we should change that. Mr. Hannon, looks like you have something.
I don't see any need to undo a prior deal.
Is there agreement on that point other than Mr. Pollack? Okay. All right. Anything else that we need on this point? I guess I asked that question to you, Mr. Mars. Are we good on this?
I think you are.
Ms. Francis, I need the language for the executive session.
I sent it to you, but I can't.
Did you text it to me or did you email it to me?
I emailed it to you.
No, I need it texted, please.
Okay. How about this? Perhaps I can read it for you.
That's even better.
Perfect.
So before she does that, do you need to do anything additionally, Mr. Mars, about the COVID issue?
I do not.
What about new business?
Oh, okay. Hold on a second, Mr. Gagas. Let me get back up to our agenda here. Okay, new business. Yes.
Okay, May is known as the month of memorials. Part of that is the Peace Officers Memorial, which pays tribute to local, state, and federal law enforcement officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice or have been injured in the line of duty. It would only be appropriate if the village of Riverside would fly the blue line memorial flag for the month of May, from May 1st through May 31st. I'll remind my fellow board members that in the aftermath of last July's board meeting, the public made it very clear that they do want us to fly flags that support law enforcement officers, the blue line, and first responders. They told us in public comment, they told us by email, and on social media. We have an obligation to do exactly that. It is, after all, a responsibility that we decided to put upon our shoulders. That's the new business I had tonight, Ben.
Okay, so that's obviously not something we can take any action on since it wasn't noticed up. And unless I hear from a majority of trustees to the contrary, I'm not going to put that on an agenda because we've had that conversation before.
It's a different flag and it's a different occasion.
We can have a discussion about this after the meeting. Okay, so we do have a need for an executive session this evening. Ms. Francis, can you tell us why?
Certainly, to discuss pending, probable, or imminent litigation per 5 ILCS 120/2 C11.
Okay. So with that, I'd ask for a motion, a second to adjourn, not to reconvene the final action.
I'll make a motion.
Motion by Ms. Evans,
Second.
second by Mr. Gallegos. Mr. Marville, thank you for hanging in there so long for us tonight. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Meeting is adjourned. Good night.